Hello, Limitless Souls. Welcome back to Astra Limitless. Today's episode is going to be a little deeper than usual because we're going to talk about something that almost every human being carries in some form: trauma. But I want to approach this topic carefully because trauma is one of those words that has become very common online. You hear it everywhere, on social media, in psychology discussions, in spiritual communities, and sometimes the word is used so often that it starts losing its depth. So today, I want to slow down and explore a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. Can we truly heal from trauma? Or do we simply learn how to live with it? Because if you've ever tried to heal something deeply painful from your past, you may have noticed something strange. You might understand it intellectually, you might process it emotionally, and you might even forgive the people involved. And yet, something inside you still reacts. A memory, a trigger, a moment where your body suddenly remembers before your mind does. And that's when many people start wondering, am I actually healing, or am I just getting better at managing the pain? And that's what we're going to explore today. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge something important: that this episode is not meant to replace therapy, professional support, or deep personal work. Trauma is complex, and everyone's experience is different. What we're doing here is reflecting together, exploring how psychology, awareness, and spirituality intersect when it comes to healing. So if you're listening to this while walking, working, or just sitting quietly somewhere, take a breath for a moment. Because this conversation is not about reopening wounds. It's about understanding ourselves better. And sometimes understanding is the first step towards freedom. Welcome to Astra Limitless Podcast, a space where consciousness expands, healing begins, and we remember who we truly are. I am Astra, your host and fellow traveler on this journey of awakening. Each episode is an invitation to go deeper into the mind, soul, and the infinite possibilities that live within you. So take a deep breath, open your heart, and let's begin. Let's start with something that might sound simple but is actually very important. Most people think trauma is the event itself. That something bad happened, something painful occurred, someone hurt us, something frightening happened. But trauma is not actually the event. Trauma is the imprint that event leaves inside the nervous system. Two people can experience the exact same event and walk away with completely different internal reactions, right? One person processes it, integrates it, and moves forward. The other person carries the emotional imprint for years, sometimes even decades. So trauma isn't simply about what happened. It's about how the mind and body stored what happened. This is where psychology gives us an important insight: that when something overwhelming occurs, something the mind cannot process in the moment, the nervous system shifts into survival mode. Fight, flight, and freeze. And in those moments, the brain is not trying to analyze the meaning or create understanding. It's just simply trying to keep you alive. And because survival becomes the priority, the experience doesn't always get processed properly. Instead, it gets stored in the body, in emotional memory, is stored in the nervous system. Which is why years later, something small can trigger a reaction that feels completely out of proportion. Right? It can be a tone of voice, a look, a situation that reminds your mind, even subconsciously, of the original experience. And suddenly, your body reacts again. Your heart rate changes, your thoughts racing. Sometimes you don't even understand why. This is one of the most confusing parts of trauma. Because people often say things like, I thought I was over it. I have already processed this. I shouldn't still feel this way. But trauma doesn't operate only on the level of thought. It operates on the level of experience, which means healing cannot happen through understanding alone. Yes, understanding helps, right? But it's only part of the process. Another reason trauma is difficult to heal is because many of the patterns it creates become invisible to us. When something affects us deeply, our mind often builds protective strategies. For example, someone who experiences rejection may become extremely independent. Someone who experiences chaos may become highly controlling. Someone who experiences emotional neglect may become very sensitive to other people's mood. These adaptations help us survive, but over time, they start shaping our personality, and we begin to believe that this is just who we are. But sometimes, what we think is personality is actually just adaptation. The mind's way of protecting us from being hurt again. Because many of the things people struggle with as adults, like anxiety, people pleasing, difficulty trusting others, fear of abandonment, it often traces back to earlier experiences. And it can be because of subtle things like emotional neglect, unpredictable environments, or growing up in situations where emotions were not acknowledged. The mind learns from those environments. It develops strategies, and those strategies stay with us long after the original situation has passed. Which leads us back to the question of this episode. If trauma leaves these deep imprints, can we ever truly heal it? Or do we simply become more aware of it? And if awareness is the key, what does that actually mean? Because awareness alone doesn't erase memory, right? It doesn't magically remove emotional patterns. So what role does awareness really play in healing? And that's where psychology and spirituality begin to intersect in a very interesting way. Because psychology helps us understand how trauma forms. But spirituality often asks a different question. Who are we beyond what happened to us? And that question changes the conversation entirely. Because if we define ourselves entirely by our past experiences, then healing becomes very limited. We become the person who was hurt, rejected, or experienced something painful. But awareness introduces another possibility, that we are not only the story of what happened, we are also the observer of that story. And that shift from being the story to observing the story is where deeper healing can begin. But that shift doesn't happen overnight, of course. It is a process of noticing patterns, understanding reactions, and slowly separating our identity from the experiences that shaped us. One of the less obvious ways trauma influences our lives is through identity. Not just emotions or reactions, but the way we understand who we are. Psychology often talks about something called narrative identity. This is the story we tell ourselves about our lives. Every person consciously or unconsciously builds a narrative that explains their experiences. We interpret our past, connect events together, and slowly construct a personal storyline. For example, I'm the person who always has to be strong. Or I'm the one who people eventually leave. Or I'm the one who has to take care of everyone else. These narratives often develop quietly over time. They're rarely chosen intentionally. Instead, they form gradually as the mind tries to make sense of repeated emotional experiences. And once a narrative becomes familiar, it can begin shaping the way we see the future. A person who believes they are the one who gets abandoned may unconsciously interpret normal relationship challenges as signs that abandonment is coming again. Someone who believes they must always be strong may struggle to ask for help, even when support would actually allow them to heal. And what's interesting is that these narratives are not lies. They are the mind's attempt to organize experience. But a danger comes when the narrative becomes the entire identity. When the story stops being something that happened to us and becomes something we believe we are. This is where trauma can quietly limit our sense of possibility. Because if your identity becomes built around survival, it becomes difficult to imagine life beyond survival. The nervous system remains oriented towards protection rather than expansion. But psychology and spirituality both hint at, though they describe it differently, identity is not fixed. The story we tell ourselves about our lives can evolve. And it's not by denying what happened. It's not by pretending the past was harmless or not painful, but by recognizing that the meaning we assign to our experiences is not permanent. For example, someone who once saw themselves as the person who had to endure hardship may eventually begin seeing themselves as the person who learned resilience. The events did not change, but the meaning did. And meaning is powerful because it influences the way we approach the present. It shapes whether we move through life expecting harm or expecting growth. It shapes whether we interpret challenges as proof that life is against us or as opportunities to understand ourselves more deeply. This shift does not happen instantly, and it often begins very quietly. It sometimes begins with a single moment of realization, a moment where we notice that we are observing our own thoughts, observing our reaction, the old narratives that once felt unquestionable. And in that moment of observation, something subtle becomes clear, that the observer is not the same thing as the story. The observer is not the same thing as the reaction. And the observer is not the same thing as the trauma. This insight appears in many spiritual traditions, but it also appears in modern psychology through practices like mindfulness and metacognition. It both point towards the same realization that there is difference between experiencing a thought and being the thought. There is a difference between having a reaction and being defined by that reaction. And when we begin to notice the difference, we gain a kind of freedom that did not exist before. This is why awareness is often described as transformative, because awareness does not erase experiences, but it changes our relationship with them. The past stops being the center of our identity and becomes part of our story, but not the entire story. And when that happens, something else becomes possible: growth. Not the kind of growth that ignores the pain, but the kind that integrates it. The kind that allows someone to say, yes, those experiences shaped me, but they are not the only thing that defines me. From a psychological perspective, this is often called integration. Integration means that the past is acknowledged, understood, and processed, but it no longer dominates the present. The emotional intensity is softened, the pattern becomes easier to notice and interrupt, and the nervous system slowly learns that the world is not always the same place it once was. One of the questions that comes up again and again when people begin exploring trauma is whether true healing is actually possible. Because if trauma shapes the nervous system, influences identity, and creates patterns that can last for years, sometimes the idea of healing can feel unrealistic. It can feel like the past will always have some kind of hold over us. And in a way, that concern is understandable. Because healing does not mean the past disappears, right? It does not mean that memories will vanish or that the nervous system never reacts again. But healing changes something very important: the relationship between the past and the present. When trauma is still unprocessed, the past often feels like it is happening now. The nervous system reacts as if the original danger is still present. But as healing unfolds, the nervous system gradually learns something new. It learns that the past is no longer the present, and that learning happens slowly, through experience, awareness, and repetition. One of the first steps in this process is something surprisingly very simple, but incredibly powerful: learning to notice what is happening inside you without immediately judging it. And this may sound very small, but it changes the entire dynamic of healing. Because when we judge our reactions, we create resistance. But when we observe our reactions with curiosity instead of judgment, the nervous system begins to relax. Instead of fighting our internal experience, we begin to understand it. That shift from criticism to awareness creates a small amount of space. Simple practices like grounding, slow breathing, physical movement, or even pausing to notice that the present moment can slowly help the nervous system recalibrate. But healing, it's not only about calming the nervous system, right? It also involves something deeper: self-compassion. Because many people carry an enormous amount of self-blame about their past. Because they believe they should have reacted differently, should have known better, should be stronger. But healing often begins when we recognize that the person we were at that time did the best they could. Our younger version was just trying to survive emotionally, trying to navigate situations that may be confusing for them, overwhelming, or painful. And when we begin to see our younger version with compassion rather than criticism, then something inside us will begin to soften. And when that happens, we can use the energy for creativity, connection, curiosity, for living in the present moment instead of constantly reacting to the past. Life begins to feel a little more spacious, a little less controlled by old patterns, a little more open. Painful experiences do not automatically become wisdom. But when they are processed, understood, and integrated, they can transform the way we relate to life. They can make us more aware, compassionate, intentional, and it brings us back to the original question. Can we truly heal from trauma? Or do we simply learn to live with it? The answer is that healing does not erase the past, but it changes the power the past holds over the present. Yes, the memories remain, but they no longer control every reactions. The experiences remain, but they no longer define our entire identity. And perhaps most importantly, we begin to realize that we are more than the things that happen to us. We are also the awareness that observes, learns, and grows beyond them. And that awareness is where freedoms truly begin.
Thank you for tuning in to the Astra Limitless Podcast. If today's episode spoke to your soul, share it with someone who might need its light. You can follow and connect with me on social media for more reflections, tools, and inspiration on this path of awakening. Until next time, stay grounded, stay open, and remember, you are limitless.